Alright guys, today we're going to talk about the changing roles of women during the 1920s. So, I want you guys to look at these pictures and tell me what these bring to mind, what they make you think of.
Voting.
Voting rights, right?
Loosening up a little bit from what we've seen before.
The loosening up, yeah, which pictures do you get that from?
Especially those two,
These ones?
and then the bottom one a little bit as well.
Yeah, the flapper girls. So the 20s, the 1920s, you guys have heard it referred to as the Roaring 20s, right? And so there was a lot of changes happening at this time. Women were fighting for a lot of different things. Let's compare just side by side these two pictures. So we see on this side, this was from the 1900s. So this is just like up until the 1920s, the 1900s, 1910s, this was the fashion. And then this side is the 1920s. And that was some of the fashions there. So what major differences do you see in those pictures?
Skirts are a lot shorter on the right side.
Yeah, the skirts are a lot shorter, right?
It's a lot sexier on the right side.
Yeah.
A lot more. Just even
Promiscuous, maybe?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is very conservative, right? And like regal, and it's still kind of more like the royal era or that type of thing. And on this side, we have more of the promiscuous and like the 20s when everything was changing. So we're gonna take a minute or two and write in our journals our thoughts about the 1920s, just to start off our day, and then we're gonna get into what the roles were that women were fighting for, and different things like that, and we'll talk about some of the major reforms along the way and how we got to the 1920s and where we're gonna go. So if you guys just wanna take a minute to write in your journals your thoughts after looking at these pictures, I'll put it back to this screen. About the 1920s and some of the things we just discussed. If you can just do that for your daily question for today. And then we will get started on the rest of the PowerPoint. That's what I listen by. Is it
7
minutes?
Mhm.
She's way over.
Okay, now that we paused and did our journals. So some of the things that women were fighting for in the 1920s, it wasn't just the right to vote. So we saw a lot of pictures with the right to vote, and that was a big thing that women were fighting for, was a big thing that they wanted. But so that word is suffrage. So suffrage is the word that they used for the right to vote. So if we're going to analyze some primary documents in a little bit, so if you see the word suffrage in there, make sure you connect it back to the voting. That's what it is. The second one, a big thing that they were doing was equal treatment for women under the law. So women didn't have financial rights with their husband, they didn't have divorce rights, they didn't have equal jobs or pay. And so they wanted equal treatment under the law. They wanted to be made a law that they had to have equal rights, they had to have equal pay and things like that. Austin?
That's 7 minutes left, not 7 minutes that have passed. Just
Oh, you're sitting at 10 minutes.
Yes.
Oh, perfect. Another big thing they were fighting for was birth control. So at the time, women were having families, and they had huge families back then. You've seen pictures, right, from the 1900s and stuff like that, when they just had these massive families, and they didn't have any forms of birth control for the women. So that was another thing that they were fighting for. Like we mentioned, the financial rights, they didn't have any rights to their husband's money or to the money that they earned. When they earned money, the money went right to their husbands. And it went into like the family income. They weren't allowed to have their own income and their own money and things like that. They didn't have the right to divorce. They didn't have the same educational opportunities at the time. There wasn't really women doctors or women scientists or women, anything like those big roles that you had to go to school for a lot, lawyers, things like that. So they were really fighting for educational opportunities at the time. Like we mentioned, equal jobs and pay. They wanted to be able to do the man's job. And World War II comes along a little bit later, and you guys have all seen the Rosie the Riveter poster, of the woman flexing, and she has the bandana in her hair. And that's really when the kind of equal jobs came into play, because the men went off to war, and the women were able to step in and fill those positions. But this is when it started, when they started fighting for that. And the last one is the same code of morals. What do you guys think that means? Same code of morals.
Like a double standard.
Double standard, exactly. So let's go back to, if we go back to this picture right here, comparing. In the 1900s, early 1900s, women were expected to be regal and well-dressed and quiet and motherly and womanly. They weren't allowed to like drink and smoke in public or ride bikes or anything like that. And men were basically allowed to do whatever they wanted. There wasn't really any rules for men at the time. They were allowed to do whatever. And women were not okay with that. So they wanted the same code of morals. They wanted to be able to do whatever they wanted without being judged or without being called promiscuous and things like that, which is why things started to change. So that was another big thing that they were fighting for at the time. So now we're going to step into some of the reforms that happened at the time. The very first reform that happened was the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention. And this is where your guided notes are going to start. So will you guys make sure that you pull out your guided notes and fill those in on this, because all of these reforms are going to be on the test. We're going to be tested about them at the end of this unit. So make sure you're following along in your guided notes and filling in all the information so that you have it when we study and do reviews and stuff like that. So 1848 was the first one. It was the Seneca Falls Convention, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the leader of it. And this is a picture of her right here when she was older. So it was the very first one. Like I mentioned, it was 2 days long, and they came out with a Declaration of Sentiments. Declaration of Sentiments was signed by 68 women and 32 men. So that's kind of surprising, right? Because it was a women's convention for women's rights, and 32 men signed it. So there were some men at the time that wanted equal rights, but most of them wanted their wives to stay quiet and stay at home and be a mom. They didn't want them to have these rights. They didn't want them to vote. They didn't think that women were smart enough to vote. They weren't involved enough in politics. But there were some men that did believe in that. So we can see that from that. They had 12 resolutions that they wanted for equal rights that they proposed. And some of those resolutions were some of the ones that we talked about earlier that we mentioned. And we'll get into those a little bit more as we talk about the different conventions and what they wanted in each convention. So, Austin, do you want to just read this first sentence for me? Well, I guess it's all one sentence, this first paragraph for me. And when Austin's reading this, so this is the introduction to the Declaration of Sentiments that they came up with. When Austin's reading this, I want you to think of what it reminds you of that we've learned about earlier in history, okay?
When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one portion of the family of man to assume among the people of the earth a position different from that which they have hitherto occupied, but one to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes that impel them to such a course.
Perfect. And then I'm going to read this first sentence, and I want you guys to think of what it reminds you of. So it says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So what does that make you think of?
Declaration of Independence.
The Declaration of Independence, exactly. So basically, these women are taking the Declaration and the Constitution and they're kind of shoving it back in the men's face. They threw in here, if you notice, that all men and women are created equal. And in the Declaration, it just says that all men are created equal, right? And so they're saying we are endowed with certain inalienable rights and we don't have them right now. And so that's what they were fighting for. And this is the introduction to the Declaration of Sentiments that they had. That's the end of my lesson that I prepared. How long was that?